It was a quiet afternoon when he decided to visit the old cemetery on the edge of town. The place wasn't far from where he lived, but few people ever went there anymore. The main gates creaked when pushed open, and the path inside was covered with dry leaves. Tall grass had grown wild between the graves, and some of the stones had cracked from years of wind and rain. To most people, it was just another forgotten place. But to him, old cemeteries had always held a strange kind of peace. He liked walking there, reading the faded names and imagining who those people once were. He didn't go there out of sadness. It was more out of respect. Sometimes he brought a small brush and a bucket of water to clean a few graves that looked completely neglected. He always thought that even if no one remembered those people anymore, they still deserved to have their names visible even for a moment. That small act made him feel connected to time itself, like the past wasn't truly gone as long as someone still cared enough to look. That afternoon, the sun was warm, and the air smelled faintly of pine and dust. Birds sang somewhere far off, and every now and then a breeze would move through the tall grass, making it sound like a soft whisper. He walked slowly along the old rows, brushing his hand against the tops of stones, most of which were unreadable now. He stopped every few steps to pull away a bit of ivy or move a fallen branch. It was quiet work, the kind that lets your thoughts drift without rush. After about an hour, he reached a section of the graveyard he had never seen before. The path leading there was narrow, almost hidden behind an old iron fence that leaned sideways. The grass was much taller in this area, and the gravestones were darker, almost black with age. It felt like this part hadn't been visited for decades. Something about it drew him in. Maybe it was the feeling that this place had stories that no one had listened to in a very long time. He started clearing away weeds from the first few stones, reading what little he could. Most of the names had faded away completely. On one of the stones, only the year was visible, 1903. On another, the top half had broken off, leaving just a rough edge. But then he noticed one that stood out from the rest. It was taller, made of a lighter stone, though nearly covered in moss and dirt. Despite the weathering, it was still standing perfectly straight, like it had refused to fall even after 100 years. He walked closer and knelt down, brushing his fingers across the surface. The texture of the moss was soft and cool, and as he wiped it away slowly, faint letters began to appear. They were carved deeply but worn smooth by time. He could make out the first name, though the last was harder to read. The date at the bottom showed that the person buried there had died in the early 1900s, over a century ago. He whispered the name quietly, almost as a sign of respect, though no one could hear. Something about that grave felt different. Maybe it was the way it stood alone, or maybe the way the sunlight hit it through the trees. There was a feeling, not fear, not sadness, just a quiet sense that this stone had seen and kept something no one else knew. He sat there for a moment, just looking at it, before deciding he'd come back the next day to clean it properly. As he stood up to leave, he noticed how still everything around him had become. Even the birds had gone quiet. It wasn't an eerie kind of silence, just the kind that made you aware of every sound you made. When he turned to go, he took one last look back at the tall grave, half covered in shadow. For some reason, it stayed in his mind the whole way home. That evening, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He tried reading, watching something, even listening to music, but his mind kept returning to that grave. The moss, the half-faded letters, the date carved so long ago. He had cleaned dozens of graves before, but never had one left such a deep impression. Maybe it was because this one seemed lonely, forgotten in a way that felt unfair. The next morning, he packed a small bag with his usual cleaning tools, a soft brush, some water, gentle soap, and a few old rags. He also took a small candle, something he liked to light as a quiet gesture once he finished cleaning a grave. When he arrived at the cemetery, the morning air was cool and damp. Dew covered the grass, and tiny droplets clung to the edges of spiderwebs stretched between the stones. The world felt calm and untouched. He made his way back to the same section he had discovered the day before. The tall grave was waiting there, just as he had left it. He took a deep breath and started working. Slowly and carefully, he brushed away the moss, poured a bit of water, and wiped the surface until the stone began to reveal its color again, a pale gray beneath all the years of dirt. Each letter appeared more clearly, and soon he could read the name completely. He said it out loud, softly, as if introducing himself. He noticed something unusual while cleaning. Small marks along the side of the stone that didn't seem to be part of the original carving. They looked like faint initials etched by hand, not by a mason. They were too small to see from a distance, hidden beneath the moss until now. He leaned closer and ran his finger over them. Whoever had made them must have done it years after the stone was placed. It wasn't vandalism. It felt intentional, almost personal, like someone had wanted to leave a quiet message. He continued cleaning, brushing away the soil around the base of the stone. That's when his fingers touched something hard under the surface. At first he thought it was just a small rock, but when he dug a little more carefully, he realized it was metallic. He brushed away the dirt and pulled out a small rusted object, a locket, round and old-fashioned, with an engraved pattern barely visible through the tarnish. He felt his heartbeat quicken slightly. It was strange to find something like that right beside the grave, buried just deep enough to stay hidden. He sat back on his knees and turned the locket over in his hand. It was cold and heavier than he expected. He tried to open it, but the clasp was stuck from rust. After a few careful tries, it finally clicked open with a soft snap. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph. A young woman dressed in early 1900s clothing, looking directly at the camera with a faint, serious expression. On the opposite side was a folded piece of paper so delicate it looked like it might crumble if touched too roughly. He didn't unfold it right away. Instead, he just stared at it for a while, feeling an odd mix of curiosity and hesitation. It wasn't fear, just a deep awareness that he had stumbled onto something private, something that wasn't meant to be found easily. After a moment, he decided to look closer. The paper was yellow with age, edges torn and soft. As he unfolded it slowly, most of the words were faded beyond reading, except for one short line near the center. It said, "They must never know." He stared at those words for a long time, not sure what to think. Who wrote them? What weren't they supposed to know? Was it connected to the person buried here or to someone else entirely? The possibilities spun in his head, each one leading to more questions. He carefully closed the locket and slipped it into a small cloth bag to keep it safe. By the time he finished cleaning the grave, the sun had climbed high and the shadows had grown shorter. The stone looked different now, almost alive again, as if it had been waiting for someone to care for it. He placed the candle at the base, lit it, and stood in silence for a few moments. The flame flickered gently in the breeze, reflecting off the smooth gray surface. He didn't know why, but it felt like the right thing to do. As he packed his things and started walking back through the rows of graves, he couldn't shake the feeling that the place around him somehow felt lighter. The air didn't feel as heavy as before. But that sense of calm was mixed with curiosity, a pull that told him this story wasn't finished. There was something behind that name, those initials, that hidden message. The words "they must never know" echoed in his mind the whole way home. That night he placed the locket on his table and sat staring at it under the warm light of his lamp. He thought about the woman in the photo, who she was, what her life had been like, and why someone would bury such a thing beside her grave. It was hard to explain, but he felt a strange responsibility now, like he had been chosen by chance or fate to uncover what time had buried. It wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about giving a forgotten story a voice again, and though he didn't know it yet, the truth behind that old grave would soon take him deeper, into the town's past than he ever expected, to secrets that had been waiting quietly beneath the earth for 100 years. The next morning came quietly, but he hadn't slept much. The image of the old locket and those 4 strange words, "They must never know," kept replaying in his head. It was strange how something so small could carry such weight. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the locket lying on a folded napkin. The metal looked darker now in daylight, its pattern faint but still visible. He couldn't help but wonder who had placed it there, and why they'd wanted it hidden beside that grave. He thought about going back to the cemetery, but he also knew he needed to find out more before disturbing anything else. So he decided to start with something simple, finding out who the person buried there really was. He remembered the name carved on the stone, faint but readable now after he had cleaned it. He wrote it down carefully in a notebook along with the date. Then he grabbed his jacket and headed for the small library in town. The library wasn't big, but it had an old charm to it. The air smelled of paper and dust, and sunlight filtered through tall windows, landing on wooden tables. He had been there many times before, mostly to read about local history. The librarian, a kind woman with silver hair, greeted him with a quiet smile. She recognized him as the man who liked to read about the town's old days. When he asked if there were any records from the early 1900s, she nodded and led him to a corner shelf filled with thick, leather-bound books and old newspapers stacked neatly in boxes. He started searching through the records, carefully flipping pages so they wouldn't tear. The handwriting in some of the older books was elegant but faded, the ink turning brown with age. After almost an hour, he finally found something, a record of a burial that matched the name on the gravestone. It listed the date of death, 1923, and noted that she had been just 23 years old. But there was almost no information about her life, no family details, nothing about how she had died, just one word beside the cause of death: uncertain. That word made him pause. In all the graves he had ever cleaned, he'd never seen that listed before. Most said illness, accident, or natural causes. But uncertain felt like someone had wanted to leave it unexplained. He turned a few more pages, but there was nothing else. Then he tried looking through old newspapers from around that year. The paper was fragile, and every page he turned made a soft crackle sound. He scanned the small headlines, trying to spot her name. After a while, he found a short article, barely more than a few sentences, announcing her death. It said she was the daughter of a well-known local family at the time, but the article didn't mention how she had died, only that her passing had been a tragedy that brought great sorrow to those who knew her. No mention of any illness or event. Just a few words that left more questions than answers. As he sat there reading, the librarian walked by and glanced at the name he had written down. Her eyes lingered for a moment. "That name," she said softly. "It sounds familiar." She thought for a second, then her expression changed slightly. "If I remember right, there's an old photograph of her family in the town hall. It's part of a display from the early 1900s. She was a pretty young woman, if it's who I think it is." He thanked her, closed the record book carefully, and decided to visit the town hall next. It was only a few streets away. The building itself was old, with high ceilings and portraits of people from the town's past lining the walls. He walked slowly, scanning each frame until he found it. A family portrait taken in what looked like a garden. In the center stood the young woman from the locket. Her eyes were unmistakable, even in black and white. Standing beside her were two older adults, likely her parents, and a younger boy who looked about 10. The little plaque beneath the picture confirmed it was the same family name from the gravestone. He stared at the photo for a long time. Everyone in it looked proud and proper, dressed in fine clothes. But there was something about her expression. Not sadness exactly, more like stillness. A quietness that felt out of place next to the smiling faces around her. He wondered what her life had been like, what kind of person she was, and what could have happened to make her story disappear from the town's memory. When he asked the clerk at the front desk if there were any records of that family, she told him most of their documents had been lost when part of the old town office burned down many decades ago. Still, she mentioned one thing that caught his attention. The family had moved away from the area shortly after the young woman's death and never returned. The house they once owned had stood empty for years before being torn down. "Some people used to say that the family didn't like to talk about what happened," the clerk said quietly. But that was a long time ago. He thanked her and left, walking slowly down the street, his mind spinning with thoughts. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain. The gray clouds above matched the feeling in his chest, a mix of curiosity and sadness. He didn't know why this story mattered so much to him, but it did. Maybe it was because he couldn't stand the thought of someone being forgotten like that. Their whole life reduced to a single word: uncertain. That night, he sat again at his kitchen table with the locket in front of him. The rain tapped gently on the window as he looked at the photograph inside. The young woman seemed to be looking back at him now, as if asking to be remembered. He wondered who the initials carved into the side of her grave belonged to. He took out his notebook and wrote them down carefully. They didn't match her initials, which meant they had to belong to someone else, maybe someone close to her. He looked again at the words on the fragile paper. They must never know. It sounded like a message of secrecy or protection, not guilt. Maybe it wasn't meant to hide something terrible. Maybe it was meant to protect someone from pain. But from what? The following day, he went back to the cemetery. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground soft and the air cool. The stone he had cleaned stood out among the others now, brighter and easier to read. He knelt beside it, tracing the letters with his fingertips again. For some reason, it felt comforting, as if the grave wasn't just a piece of stone anymore, but part of a story that was finally waking up. As he looked around, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Behind the main stone, half buried under a layer of leaves, was a small piece of wood. He brushed it off and realized it was part of an old fence post. But beside it, sticking slightly out of the soil, was something metallic again. Not shiny, but enough to catch his eye. He cleared the dirt away and pulled out a small, thin metal tag. It was worn almost smooth, but he could still make out a few letters. They were the same initials he had found carved into the stone. The same ones engraved on the locket. That moment sent a chill through him, not from fear, but from the feeling that this story was deeper than he thought. Someone had cared enough to mark this place again and again, long after the world had stopped visiting it. Someone had left pieces of their heart here. He stayed a while longer, sitting quietly beside the grave. The sound of the wind moving through the trees was the only thing breaking the silence. He thought about the man or woman who might have left those initials, the person who once held that locket, the one who wrote that note. Maybe they had come here years after her death, leaving small signs that only they would understand. As the sky began to darken, he packed his things, but didn't leave right away. He stood there looking at the grave one last time before walking out through the rusted gates. On his way home, he couldn't stop thinking about those missing records, those initials, and that one short message that seemed to hide an entire story behind it. When he reached home, he placed the metal tag beside the locket on his table. The two small objects looked ordinary, yet they felt heavy with meaning. He decided that the next step was to find out who those initials belonged to. Someone must have known her, loved her, maybe even buried the secret that note hinted at. He didn't know what he would find, but one thing was clear now. The grave he had cleaned wasn't just another forgotten corner of the past. It was the beginning of something that had waited 100 years to be uncovered, and he was the one who had stumbled upon it, simply because he cared enough to clean what everyone else had forgotten. He woke up earlier than usual the next morning, with the same thought still running through his mind. The initials. They had become a mystery he couldn't ignore. They appeared on the gravestone, on the locket, and now on that small metal tag he found near the base of the grave. It wasn't a coincidence. Whoever had carved them, whoever had placed those items there, must have cared deeply about the woman buried beneath that stone. He sat at the edge of his bed for a long time, holding the locket in his hand. The metal felt cold but familiar now, like it had a story that wanted to be told. He decided he needed to learn who those initials belonged to. If he could find that person in the town's old records, maybe everything else would start to make sense. After breakfast, he walked back to the library. The librarian greeted him kindly again, a little curious to see him returning so soon. He explained that he was trying to trace a pair of initials connected to a grave he had cleaned, old ones from the early 1900s. She smiled slightly and led him to the same corner of the library where the town archives were kept. If those initials belong to someone local, there's a good chance we'll find them here, she said softly before leaving him to work. He pulled out the thick book of town records again, running his finger along the pages filled with neat cursive handwriting. The ink had faded, but the names were still readable. He flipped through every entry from around 1910 to 1930, searching for anyone whose initials matched the ones carved on the grave. After more than an hour, he found something that made him pause. There was a record of a young man, a craftsman, whose initials matched exactly. He had worked as a carpenter in town during the same years the woman on the gravestone was alive. But something about the entry stood out. There were no further records of him after 1923, the same year the woman had died. It was as if he had vanished from the town's history after that. That discovery made his heart race a little. He wrote down everything from the record, the man's full name, the address listed, and the year of disappearance. The address was near the river on the south side of town, a place where older houses still stood, some half collapsed, others barely holding on. He thanked the librarian and left the building with a quiet determination. The afternoon sun had turned the streets golden, and as he walked, he noticed how the town itself seemed to hold on to its past in small ways. Faded signs, cracked sidewalks, rusted fences. He reached the old part of town and found the street listed in the records. Most of the houses there looked abandoned. Only a few had curtains in the windows. The address he was looking for led him to a small wooden house, its paint long faded, its roof slightly caved in at the edges. The place looked empty, yet strangely preserved, like no one had lived there for years, but time had been kind to it somehow. He walked around the property slowly, peering through the broken window. Inside, the light fell across old furniture covered in dust. The air smelled of wood and rain. He didn't go inside, of course. He didn't want to trespass, but standing there, he could almost imagine the man who had once lived there, someone who might have made furniture with his own hands, someone who might have fallen in love with the young woman whose grave now stood so silently under the trees. As he stood near the fence, he noticed a small sign half buried in the grass. It had the same initials carved into it, the same pattern, the same style of letters. The edges were worn, but the carving was deep enough to last. That was when he knew without doubt that the man in the records was connected to the grave. He returned home with a notebook full of notes and a mind full of questions. He couldn't stop wondering what had happened between those two people, the young woman and the carpenter. The town records didn't say much, but there was one more place he could check: the Historical Society. It was a small office near the town square that kept photographs, letters, and maps that didn't fit in the library. The next morning, he went there. The man at the front desk was friendly but surprised when he heard the name of the woman from the grave. "That's an old story," he said, shaking his head slightly. "People don't talk about it much anymore. There were rumors back then, family problems, disagreements, and something about a young man who worked for them. But no one ever knew what really happened." He asked if there were any old letters, photographs, or records from that family. The man thought for a moment, then disappeared into a back room filled with boxes and old folders. After a few minutes, he returned with a thin file covered in dust. "This is all we've got left," he said. Inside were a few documents: a property deed, a newspaper clipping, and an old photograph. The picture showed the same house he had seen at the edge of town. The back of it had a short message written in faded ink: "Our meeting place." He turned the paper over slowly, feeling the weight of those words. It was easy now to imagine what had happened. The young woman had come from a well-off family, and the man she loved had worked with his hands. Maybe her family didn't approve of him. Maybe they had kept their love secret, meeting in that small house by the river. The locket, the initials, the message in the note, they must never know. All of it began to fit together. But one thing still didn't make sense. Why had the man disappeared after she died? What had happened to him? The man from the Historical Society said quietly. There was talk that he left town. Some said he couldn't stay after what happened. Others said he might have stayed in secret. But there's no record of him ever being seen again. Those words stayed in his head as he walked back home. The story was starting to take shape, but it was still incomplete. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the grave had looked before he cleaned it. How lonely it had seemed, how overgrown and forgotten. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the man who loved her had left all those signs, the initials, the locket, the metal tag, as a way of being close to her without being seen. Maybe those were his quiet visits, left over years, even decades. That night he placed the locket, the tag, and the photo on his table. He stared at them for a long time, trying to imagine their lives, the quiet meetings, the hidden love, the promise that they would be together despite the world around them. And then the tragedy that ended it all. He could almost feel their presence in the silence of his home. Not haunting, but heavy with longing, like their story wanted to be remembered. He made a decision that night. He was going to return to the grave again, but this time not just to clean or to look. He wanted to make sure the truth, whatever it was, didn't stay buried. The following day he returned just as the sun began to set. The cemetery was quiet again, bathed in golden light. He knelt by the grave and whispered softly, "I found him." The words felt strange to say out loud, but somehow right. He told the story as he understood it, about the records, the house by the river, and the photograph. He didn't know if anyone could hear, but speaking it aloud felt like setting something free. As he sat there, he noticed something else. The ground beside the grave looked uneven, as if the soil had been disturbed long ago. He brushed away the loose dirt with his hands, finding a piece of wood, the remains of a small box rotted from time. It crumbled easily, but inside it, Something metallic caught the fading light. It was a ring, simple and silver, still shining faintly despite the years. Inside the band were the same two initials engraved side by side. He held the ring tightly in his hand, feeling the cool metal press against his skin. It was all the proof he needed. The initials belonged to both of them, the young woman and the man she loved. The grave wasn't just hers. It was a symbol of them both. As the light faded, he placed the ring gently at the base of the stone, beside the candle he had lit weeks ago. The flame flickered softly and the breeze carried the faint scent of the earth. He whispered a quiet promise that he would tell their story, that their love wouldn't stay forgotten. When he walked out of the cemetery, the sky was turning deep blue and stars were beginning to appear. The wind rustled the leaves gently, almost like a sigh. He didn't know what else he might discover, but one thing was certain now. The story hidden beneath that 100-year-old grave wasn't just about loss. It was about love strong enough to last through silence, secrecy, and time itself. And even though the world had forgotten them, their story had finally started to speak again. He stood at the edge of the graveyard that morning, his breath making small clouds in the cool air. The light was soft, almost silver, and a thin mist clung to the ground like a blanket that hadn't been folded away. He felt uneasy, not because of fear, but because of the strange mix of curiosity and worry inside him. The night before, he had barely slept. His mind kept circling around the small metal box he had found buried under the old headstone. He hadn't opened it yet. It was sitting on the corner of his kitchen table, wrapped in an old towel. Every time he passed by, he felt its presence like a weight. What if it was something valuable? What if it was something he shouldn't have touched? The possibilities spun in his mind like dust in sunlight. That morning, he decided he couldn't let the day go without finding out. He made himself a cup of tea, sat down, and stared at the towel. For a long time, he didn't move. Then slowly, he pulled the cloth away. The box was small, square, and covered in rust. Its latch was stiff but not locked. He used a flathead screwdriver to pry it open. Inside, there were folded papers, yellowed and fragile. Beneath them, there was something else, a small locket on a chain, dull with age. His hands trembled as he lifted it out. The locket clicked open easily, revealing two faded photographs inside. One was of a woman wearing a long dress and a soft smile. The other was of a young boy, maybe 10 years old, with a wide grin that looked full of life. He set it down gently and unfolded the papers. The handwriting was careful, elegant, and written in ink that had turned brown over time. The first page was a letter. It began simply, "To whoever finds this, please know that I never meant for this to be hidden forever." He read each line slowly. The letter was written by the woman in the photograph. Her name was Margaret. She explained that the grave belonged to her husband, who had died suddenly a century ago. In her grief, she had buried the locket and letter beneath the headstone as a promise that she would someday be reunited with him. But her letter also mentioned something else. Something about a secret she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone while she was alive. He frowned and kept reading. The next page was more personal. She wrote about her husband's work at a local mill, about an accident that had happened and how she believed it wasn't truly an accident. She said her husband had discovered something wrong, missing money, unfair treatment of workers, and people willing to hurt others to stay silent. Her words were full of sorrow, not anger. She wrote that she feared speaking out because she was alone and afraid of losing what little she had left. The man sat back in his chair, stunned. This wasn't just a love letter, it was a confession, a story buried beneath stone and silence. He felt a deep ache for her, this woman who had carried such pain, whose story had never been told. He imagined her standing over the grave 100 years ago, her dress brushing the ground, her hands trembling as she buried the box, whispering a promise to keep his memory safe. The rest of the day passed in a haze. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Every small sound, the ticking clock, the wind through the trees, felt louder somehow. He knew he had to do something, but what? Should he tell someone? Should he leave it alone, respecting her wish to let the secret rest? That evening, he decided to return to the graveyard. The sky was darkening when he arrived, and the wind had picked up, rustling the trees. He carried the box with him, the letter folded neatly inside again. He wanted to put it back, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the feeling that this story deserved to be known, that someone should remember Margaret's truth. He sat beside the grave for a long time. The air smelled of earth and pine. Somewhere nearby, a bird called softly before disappearing into the trees. He spoke out loud, his voice quiet but steady. "I found your letter," he said. "I don't know what you wanted me to do with it, but I promise I'll handle it carefully." As he sat there, he noticed something odd about the ground beside the grave. It looked uneven, like someone had dug there long ago. He brushed the dirt aside with his hand, his heart pounding faster. After a few minutes, his fingers hit something hard. He dug a little deeper and uncovered a small glass jar. Inside was another folded paper, but this one was newer, less damaged by time. He carefully opened it. The handwriting was different, sharper, bolder. It was dated 1948, nearly 30 years after Margaret's letter. The note said, "If anyone finds what my mother left behind, please understand she only wanted peace. My father's death was tragic, but some things are better left in the past." It was signed with a single initial, L. He stared at the paper, stunned. So Margaret had a child, a son or daughter who knew about the letter, and who had come years later to add their own message. They wanted to protect her memory, to make sure the story didn't stir up old pain. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the jar. As he sat there, he realized that this was more than a mystery. It was a family's buried heartache. Their secrets had been hidden beneath the earth, but not out of guilt. It was love, protection, and loss all woven together. The next few days felt heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had become part of something much bigger than he'd ever expected. He went to the local library to see if he could find anything about Margaret or her husband. The town's archives were old but well kept. He spent hours flipping through old newspapers and faded records. Finally, he found a small article dated from the early 1920s. It mentioned a man named William who had died in a factory accident. The article said it was a tragic event that had shocked the small community, but there was no follow-up, no details. Just a few lines and a grainy photo that matched the face in the locket. He stared at the clipping for a long time. The town had forgotten. The people who once whispered about it were gone. All that remained were these faint traces, letters, photos, and a rusted box buried under moss and time. That night, he walked back to the grave again, the path lit by his flashlight. The fog was thick and each breath felt cold in his lungs. He placed the locket on the stone right above where he had found it. Then he sat there in silence. He didn't know what the right thing to do was, whether to keep the letter, to tell someone, or to let it fade again into history. But he knew one thing for sure. Margaret and her husband deserved to be remembered, not as a mystery, but as two people who had loved deeply and suffered quietly. As the night deepened, he whispered, "Your story won't be forgotten." He stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands. The graveyard was still and peaceful, the wind gentle now. When he turned to leave, he thought he heard something faint, a whisper, or maybe just the wind, but it felt like a thank you. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. When he reached home, he set the box on his table one last time. Then he opened a notebook and began to write everything down, from the day he decided to clean the grave to the moment he found the letters. His handwriting was messy, but his words were full of care. He wanted to make sure that if anyone ever read it, they would feel what he felt. That strange connection to people long gone but somehow still close. The pages filled quickly. Each word seemed to lift something off his chest. When he finished, he sat quietly, listening to the soft hum of the night outside. He felt lighter, as if the grave's silence had finally been shared, as if the story itself had been waiting for him. He didn't know what would come next. Maybe he'd keep the letter safe. Maybe he'd tell the local museum. But for now, it was enough to know the secret wasn't lost anymore. The truth had been hidden under soil for 100 years, but now it had finally found its voice. The next few mornings felt strangely quiet. He woke up early each day, but the world seemed slower, softer somehow. The graveyard still sat at the edge of town, the same as always, but something inside him had changed. He had gone there first just to clean an old grave, nothing more. He thought it would be a small act of kindness, a way to bring peace to a forgotten place. But now it felt like that simple act had opened a doorway into a story that had waited 100 years to be told. He found himself walking back there almost every day that week. Not because he wanted to find anything new, but because he felt drawn to it. The grave had become a kind of quiet friend. a reminder that the past isn't as far away as it sometimes seems. When he reached the cemetery that morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the tops of the trees gold. He stood for a long moment, breathing in the stillness. The grass was damp with dew and the air smelled fresh like rain even though the sky was clear. He knelt beside the old headstone, brushing away a few leaves that had fallen overnight. "I've been thinking about you," he said softly, his hand resting on the cool stone. About what to do next. He didn't expect an answer, of course, but saying the words out loud made him feel better. He had spent the past few days reading more about the town's history, trying to find out what happened to Margaret's child, the one who had written that second note. There wasn't much, just a small record of a family that had moved away in the late 1940s. No forwarding address, no details. It was like they had quietly disappeared, leaving behind only that single message in the jar. Still, something inside him wanted to keep digging, not for secrets, but for closure. He wanted to make sure their story was remembered the right way. Later that day, he stopped by the local historical society. It was a small building, tucked between a bakery and a bookstore. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old wood. A kind-looking woman sat behind the desk, sorting through photographs. He introduced himself and explained what he had found. She listened carefully, her eyes wide with interest. When he mentioned the letters and the locket, she leaned forward. "That sounds incredible," she said softly. "We don't have much from that period left. If you're willing, we could preserve the items properly. People here would love to learn about this family's story." He hesitated for a moment. It wasn't easy to let go of something that had felt so personal. But he also knew it wasn't his to keep. "I'll bring them tomorrow," he said finally. "They deserve to be remembered." That night he sat at his kitchen table again, the same place where he had first opened the box. He carefully laid out the letters, the locket, and the photographs. The dim light made the edges of the papers glow softly. He ran his fingers over the delicate writing one last time. It struck him how powerful a few words could be, how someone's voice could travel through a century and still touch a stranger's heart. He thought about Margaret's trembling hands as she wrote those lines, about her child leaving the second note years later. He wondered if they ever found peace. He picked up the locket, opened it again, and stared at the two faces inside, the woman with her soft smile and the young boy with bright eyes. "You've been hidden long enough," he whispered. "It's time for people to know your story." The next morning, he returned to the Historical Society with the box wrapped neatly in brown paper. The woman at the desk thanked him warmly and promised they would handle everything with care. She even asked if he'd consider writing down his part of the story for their archives. He agreed, feeling proud but also humbled. When he stepped back outside, the air felt lighter. He didn't realize until then how much weight he'd been carrying. Not just the mystery itself, but the feeling that he'd somehow disturbed something sacred. Now he knew he had done the right thing. Days turned into weeks. The leaves began to change color, turning golden and red. The townspeople started talking about the story. The man who had cleaned an old grave and found a hidden box beneath it. Some called it luck, others called it fate. But for him, it wasn't about luck at all. It was about connection. One afternoon, he got a call from the woman at the Historical Society. "You might want to come by," she said. "We've had visitors.